Today we're talking about the justification or non-justification for the Renee Good shooting, and this is a Asmon versus Hasan edition as the two are debating over this issue. Of course, I am Legal Mindset, and this is where we teach you to be your own judge. This is a fast facts video, the quick and dirty version of the latest in legal news. So in case you didn't know, in January 7th, this January, there was a shooting by a ICE officer of one Renee Good, pictured in the middle. And then we, of course, have people, the online personalities, debating justification versus non-justification. Of course, debating more justification side is, of course, Asmon Gold over here. And then we've got Mr. Hasan Piker debating against justification. So today we're going to talk about the actual law, which points apply. And we're going to talk about some points which neither one of them mention, but which factor in here today legally. So let's get right into it. First of all, who is Renee Good? Well, Renee Good and her wife were anti-ICE agitators, we'll call them that, present in Minnesota on January 7th, 2026. Renee Good was shot by an ICE agent after being ordered to exit her vehicle. She was driving a Honda Pilot, and she was shot. There were 3 shots, the third of which was fatal. And then debate is split into justification, pro and con, over whether or not to say justified shoot. So let's get into the arguments pro this scenario. So when you deal with a vehicle and you're dealing with an incident where there is a vehicle, consider that that vehicle can be a deadly weapon. That's very critical to this analysis. And if somebody is using a vehicle against you, you can have a reasonable fear for your life. So that would trigger a self-defense analysis. And this would apply whether this was a ICE agent or just a random Joe on the street. And while Hasan tends to call this a fallback position, it's something that is standard and built into American law for everybody, period. So it's not really so much a fallback as just it's there, it exists, it's out there, period, under self-defense. But beyond that, because this is an ICE operation, because this is law enforcement, right, we're going to talk about whether this is domestic terrorism. These individuals were stalking, obstructing, and intimidating officers throughout the day. That's something that's very concerning for these officers and really for general ICE operations as they go on. If people are allowed to continue to obstruct, stalk, to intimidate the officers, that could be a problem for ICE operations just across the nation. You also had non-compliance and escalation in the form of refusing commands. They treated that as being disrespectful. That's their perspective of the ICE agents.
Out of the car. Get out of the car. Get out of the car.
This person was disrespectful. They were non-compliant. They refused a command to exit the vehicle. And then you've got legal immunity for officers when they're under the performance of the law. That is under Graham versus Connor. So that's the Graham standard, which we'll talk about. There are pros and cons against the application of legal immunity here, whether they're acting within the scope of their job parameters. So let's get into the cons. Well, the arguments, and these are ones that are forwarded by Hasan, were that some of them, at least this first one, that Good turned the steering wheel away. So the direction of the steering wheel, when you look at the multi-angle analysis, it looks like she was turning the steering wheel away from the officer, not towards the officer. So the officer wouldn't have that fear because, well, the car wouldn't actually hit them based on the direction of the steering wheel. That's the argument against. You also have another argument, which I don't believe either one of them made here, which is the agent violated DHS protocols. They kind of created a danger by not following their established procedures and by walking in front of the vehicle when the officer never really should have done that. They were kind of going outside the scope of their protocols. So they created that danger by not following their own protocol. The other thing is having no authority. Now, this one is one which Hasan was really vehement about, and he was barking all day in Asmon's chat.
I told you already the appropriate way of doing this by the LEO standards. You have. You've told me multiple times.
And while this may be true on paper, right, ICE does have no authority over Good as a U.S. citizen. There is to the extent, hey, look, you're interfering with operations here. You're intimidating law enforcement. There are criminal provisions involving those. But if you're going to say the baseline of the law, is ICE supposed to be interacting with U.S. citizens? No, they are not. They're not supposed to be interacting with them. They're not supposed to be going out there and detaining them unless that's as part of a particular operation, right? So this was an agitator. This was not the suspect. They were not attempting to arrest Renee and deport her, etc., right? So the authority there, yes, they didn't have authority over as a U.S. citizen. However, does that give her carte blanche to do whatever she wants? Absolutely not. Certainly not to make violent actions that could be perceived as dangerous or create fear for the officers. So that's one that I think Hasan made a big deal over, but it's not as much of a big deal as he would lead people to believe. The last one, and this is one that I think neither have put too much time into, is the post-shooting conduct. So there's a failure to render aid. They prevented a doctor from providing aid when they got to Renee and they saw she had a pulse. She was bleeding out at that point, and perhaps if they'd allowed the aid in there quicker and they'd gotten that to them quicker, Renee might have actually survived. That might have been possible. And that's something that goes to a liability standpoint. Hey, you're failing to render aid. That's a duty that you have regardless of the situation, and that could put liability on law enforcement. So what's my judgment here? My judgment is there's actually viable arguments for and against the justification. I can't say this is 100% ballpark either way. It's not possible based on the circumstances, because a perceived vehicle attack is sufficient under the Graham standard. Vehicles are considered deadly weapons, and a officer would have a very reasonable fear if they believe they're going to be run over by a car to defend themselves with deadly force, right? The deadly force of the vehicle versus the deadly force of the gun. The officer does not need to wait to be harmed under the Graham standard. So you don't need to wait until the car hits you physically to do that. Now, let's flip to the other side and let's go to something that leads against justification, is the multi-angle analysis. So looking at all of the shots, all of the angles, which we now have, it appears that that third shot came through the side window, so they were able to step out of the way. So at that point that you've stepped out of the way and you're now on the side of the car and you're still continuing to fire, that's going to lead against justification because you had that time to step away, you had an alternative, and beyond that, you broke policy. So you weren't supposed to be in front of that vehicle in the first place. That wasn't a place you were supposed to be. And because you're breaking policy, that would fall on the side of the officer. And also that post-incident failure to render aid weighs against the ICE agent and weighs towards liability on the side of the officer. So in this is a very complicated scenario. I don't think the Hasan point of authority is going to come up at all in this in terms of the application. And I do think that Asmon had some good points about common sense. Hey, if a law enforcement officer tells you to do something, you should do it. And the big important thing take away from that is that you can settle those things in court. If someone has no authority over you, take it up in court. There were a lot of times in the past where agents or agencies, etc., had no authority, even during the COVID period, and were telling people to do things that they didn't need to do. And in the moment, the actual precise moment, you need to comply with that officer. You need to do what that officer tells you to do in that moment, and then proceed to take that up in court, take that up through the established processes in order to actually fully adjudicate that. The time to make these arguments, to try to nitpick and lawyer things, is not at the scene of the incident. The time is to go into the courtroom, step in there, and prove your rights. And you know what? If they'd actually done that, they might have actually prevailed in this case, but that's not what we have here today. I want to know what you guys think about this in the comments below, and I will catch you on the next one.